If you've been with us the last few weeks, we've been going through a series called The God of Moses, and we are now at part 6. We've gone all the way from Moses' birth, and now we've talked last week about some of the wilderness wanderings, and I want to continue in that discussion just from a different angle. And tonight I want to talk about the intercession of God. I think when I look at Moses' life, this is one of the greatest qualities about him that I admire. There's others, but the fact that the way that he played the role of intercessor time and time again for the people is really incredible. A simple definition of intercession is the action of intervening on behalf of another person. But in the fourth message, we actually talked about how God intervenes on our behalf on the nation. We talked about the Red Sea and the plagues, how God himself intervened. But in this message, I want to talk about how Moses intervened on behalf of others, specifically through intercessory prayer. Intercessory prayer, many of you know, it's just simply the act of praying to God on behalf of another person or a group of people and just simply asking him to move in their lives in a specific way. That's about the most simple definition. And we don't need to make it any more complicated than that. That's all it has to be, is just going to the Lord on behalf of other people. And when we intercede, we are spiritually standing before God in someone else's place and asking him to move in their lives. And the reason we can do that is because of our relationship with God. Our relationship with God positions us in a place of spiritual authority and spiritual influence that I think many of us, we neglect or we just don't think enough about. But the closer that you get to God, the more that a concern you will find for other people. Because God's heart is always on people. He's always pursuing people. That's what he's doing right now. He's pursuing all around the world. He's pursuing people. In this room, he's pursuing people. And the closer you get to him, when you press into him, you can't help but develop a love for other people. That's just what happens. You develop a burden. There are a lot of examples of intercession in the scriptures. One of the great stories, Abraham, you remember the story where God is going to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham has this conversation with God, what if there's 50 righteous and 40 righteous? And he barters with God, and he's standing before God on behalf of these cities, and the righteous ones in the city, and he's trying to barter with God to not judge them. Paul says something really interesting in Romans 9:3. He says, when he's talking about the Jewish people, his Jewish brothers and sisters, he's so broken for the nation, and he so wants them to come to Christ. He actually makes this statement. He's like, I could wish that I was accursed from Christ if it meant the salvation of my people. That's a great intercessory heart. But of course, we know Jesus is the greatest intercessor. He came and stood in the gap for us, literally, physically, lived the life we couldn't live, and died the death that we deserve so that he could be risen again and we could receive forgiveness of our sins. But the Bible says his work of intercession didn't stop when he went to heaven. In Romans 8:34, it says, Christ who died and is also risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. That's something Jesus is doing right now. If you say, what's Jesus doing? Well, he's interceding for us. Hebrews 7:25 says that Jesus is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. All of us say, we want to be more like Jesus. We would all go around. If you're a believer, that's our goal. We want to be more Christ-like. One of the ways that we can is by tapping into intercession, because that's what he's doing, and we can actually join him in this incredible work that he is doing as we intercede for others. And intercession is an act of mercy. It's a selfless thing to do, praying for other people, and it's an act of love, but it comes from those character qualities of God. This is God's heart. It's what he does. It's what he's doing. So in the last message, you'll remember we went through some of the wilderness wanderings. We talked about 5 stories and specifically about the failures of the Israelites, because Paul was giving us a warning in Corinthians. He was saying, don't be like the Israelites, and he was giving all these illustrations. And tonight, I want to pick up on 2 of those stories, but also 3 others. But this time, I want to look at the stories from the perspective of what is Moses doing in these situations. And when you read through the story, we read a lot of it last week, it's really a miracle that the Israelites made it to the promised land. It's a miracle they're still a nation today, because you see all these times where God's judgment and wrath, he's like, I'm going to consume them, I'm going to destroy them, and then all these things happen. There's multiple times when God is just like, I'm done with them, and yet he continues on because they had an intercessor standing in the gap for them, is what we're going to see tonight, and that was Moses. So let's look at these 5 stories. I'll summarize. We'll read a few verses, but the first one we did talk about in the last message is the golden calf incident of Exodus 32. Last week, I didn't give any background about the story because we just jumped in when the golden calf was there. They're building this calf, and we talked about Aaron and all those things. But there's you got to go back a few chapters in order to figure out what Moses is doing, what is going on, why is he up on this mountain. And in Exodus 24, verse 1, the Lord calls out to Moses. He tells him, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You're to worship at a distance, but Moses alone is to approach the Lord, and others must not come near. And the people may not come up with him." And so God welcomes Moses up to the mountain. And this is really interesting. We don't have time to get into it, but I think it's fascinating. Those leaders they go to the foot of the mountain, and the scriptures record that they actually get to see God. Specifically, it says that his feet were like paved sapphire stone, as clear as the heavens, and they have a feast. They eat and drink up there. I have no idea what they saw, what that looked like, how much of God they saw. It doesn't tell us much, but it's really fascinating. God invited them up, and he revealed himself in some way to all these people. But then in verse 12, he calls out specifically to Moses. He says, "Come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I'll give you the tablets of stone and the law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them." So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua and went up to the mountain of the Lord. And verse 14 he says to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man has difficulty, let them go to them." Now, knowing what's going to happen, he probably regretted saying that, but he did say, if you got a problem, go to Aaron, okay? And they did have a problem, and they go to Aaron, and everything kind of falls apart. Verse 15 says, "Moses went up into the mountain. A cloud covered the mountain for 6 days, and on the 7th day, God invites Moses into the mountain." Now, I've got a lot of imagination, and so I think about all this stuff. But I wonder, what in the world happened between Moses and God for 40 days on that mountain? We know that God was giving him this incredible, important information for his redemptive history. We know that, it says some of the things God told him because he writes them all down, all these instructions. But just think about the fellowship that Moses had with the Lord in 40 days. It's not like God was just speaking for 12 hours a day and then Moses went to sleep and woke up and God just spoke. I mean, there had to be a lot of interaction. And we know Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, so that included Genesis. So you wonder, in that 40 days, was Moses just asking God questions? How did you create the earth? And God said, "Well, let me tell you." And Moses is, writing it down. Well, what about God's like, "Let me tell you about what happened in the garden. And let me tell you the story of Noah." I mean, all this information, who knows at what time period Moses got that from the Lord. But it's just fascinating that Moses is up there and getting to know God in a personal way and having a face-to-face conversation with the Lord. And he's getting commandments from the Lord. He's getting information about sacrifices, the sacrificial system, the tabernacle, and the priesthood. So he gets this huge dump of information from the Lord, this big download, that's just pushed down. And then in chapter 31, verse 18, God finishes speaking with him on Mount Sinai. He gives Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone written with the finger of God. So while that is happening, that's the background of what's going on. And now while that's happening, Moses is up there in the glory of God, experiencing him, fellowshipping with him. And then the people down at the foot or whatever they're starting to say, "What happened to Moses? It's been a little bit long. It's been over a month now." And they get tired of waiting, and then they go to Aaron and say, "Hey, we got this great idea. Let's make a god out of gold." And they do the earrings thing and all that stuff. So God tells him in chapter 32, verse 7, he speaks to Moses, and here's what he says. He says, "Moses, go get down, for the people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They've turned aside quickly out of the way I commanded them, and they made themselves a molded calf, and worshipped it and sacrificed to it. And they said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.'" Verse 9, the Lord says to Moses, "I've seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation." Now, understand at this point, Moses has already dealt with a lot of stuff from these people. All the way back, even during the plagues. They're at the Red Sea, and they get stuck, and they're like, why'd you bring us out here to get us killed by the Egyptians? They cross the Red Sea, they get to the bitter waters at Marah, and they're like, why did you bring us out here? We're thirsting to death. And then right after that, they're upset about the manna, it's not enough, and they want quail. I mean, this is like continually, and every time they point the finger at Moses. They come to him, and they're like, why'd you do this to us? Like, this is your fault. And Moses is like, I'm just trying to serve God. Like, what is your problem? Like, I'm just trying to like do what God's called me to do. But they're continually turning against them, ridiculing him, and making personal attacks against his leadership. So I don't know about you. Maybe Moses was more holy than I. But it might be a little bit tempting in that situation to be like, you know what, God, that's a good idea. Like, why don't you wipe them all out? They're ridiculous. I'm kind of tired of dealing with them. And you can start with my descendants. He says he'll make a great nation. He could be the father of a nation. And, maybe he was tempted to do that. But Moses had the heart of an intercessor, and he does something completely opposite. Verse 11 says, Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said this. He said, Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, he brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and all of this land that I have spoken of I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. Verse 14, so powerful. So the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. I don't know if you think of how profound this is, that, Moses could have, God just told him, I'm going to judge these people, get out of the way, I'll start over with you, but I'm done. And Moses, he could have just said, you know what, I'm tired of them, I give up, do what you want to do. He could have, what many of us might have done, and said, God, if that's your will, who am I to argue with you? Like, you're God and I'm man. I mean, honestly, like, God's saying, I'm going to judge him. It's kind of gutsy to go to God and be like, hey, you know what, maybe that's not such a good idea. Like, maybe you should change your mind. Like, who does that? But Moses had such an intimate relationship with God. He knew his heart, and he knew how to get God's attention. And he didn't allow his own selfishness, his own motives to get in the way. And God actually relents, and because he stood in the gap for them, and he pressed into his relationship with God. He's not arguing that people don't deserve judgment. I mean, the people have done what they're going to do, but he appeals to God's glory. He says it's your reputation and your glory that's at stake. So if you want to do that, think of what everyone around, all the nations are going to think something about. They're going to think you couldn't do what you said you're going to do. And he appeals to God's character and his glory, and God says, you know what, Moses, you're right, and he relents. In verse 30, it says, it came to pass the next day, Moses said to the people, you've committed a great sin, so now I'll go up to the Lord, and perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. And Moses returned to the Lord, and listen to this prayer. Oh, how these people have committed a great sin, and have made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you will, forgive their sin. But if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written. What Moses is basically saying is, God, I'm standing in the gap for them, and I want you to relent. I don't want you to judge them, but if you're going to judge them, just go ahead and include me too. If they're going to perish, I'll perish with them. It's an incredible prayer, and God doesn't take him up on it, but Moses is ready to sacrifice himself because he loves these people that God gave him so much, which is why he could pray the way that he did. It's really a reflection of Christ, who was willing to die for people that he loved, like you and I. There is a sacrifice. Most of us in intercession, as we pray for others, are probably not going to have to pray, God, kill me if that's what it takes. But we will sacrifice when you intercede. You sacrifice of your time because you're spending time in prayer. Maybe you could be doing other things. You sacrifice of your energy. You sacrifice sometimes of your tears. When you're broken over someone else and they can't even see what they're doing and you're crying out for them. You sacrifice your comfort. I remember one time I was working at a job in Springfield, and we had 3 breaks, 2 15 minutes and an hour-long lunch break. And the third break, the Lord challenged me for a few months. He said, I want you to take that last 15-minute break, and instead of socializing or whatever you're going to do, I want you to go out to your car, and I want you to intercede for people for 15 minutes. And that was great when the weather was fine, but there were times in the summer it was like 100 degrees, and I'm out there sweating. And there was times in the winter it was snowing. I was swiping the snow off and going in there. But who knows what God did in that time? but the Lord. But it was uncomfortable. It cost me something. And all of us have to be willing to get uncomfortable at times if we're really going to be intercessors for the lost and for other people in our lives. You know you have the heart of an intercessor when you can pray this: God, do for that person instead of me. You need a financial breakthrough in your life, but you see somebody who's really struggling, and you can pray, you know what, God, whatever blessing you have coming my way, give to that person instead. That's the heart of an intercessor. That's what Moses is literally saying. I'm willing to die for these people. But God is looking for believers with the heart of an intercessor, and we can cry out for it. I believe God wants every believer. It's not a special gift for a certain class of prayer warriors. It's for every one of us to stand in the gap before the Lord and pray for other people. And so the second incident I want to look at is Aaron and Miriam. This is in Numbers 12. We haven't talked about this one yet. So we know Miriam is Moses' sister. She might be biological. There's some debate about that, but we know she was there all the way at his birth and helping with getting him in the basket and all that stuff. She was involved with that. And Aaron is his brother, both older. And they come and they speak against, this is Numbers 12:1. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman who he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. Now, there's a little bit of a debate about who that was. We know that he married a woman named Zipporah in Midian. Most likely, she was not Ethiopian based on just culture at that time, but it's possible Moses had two wives, but it's probable that Zipporah had died, and the scriptures don't record it, and he got remarried. But for whatever reason, Miriam and Aaron don't like it. They're mad. And so they come against Moses, and they complain against him, and they say in verse 2, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?" And it says right there at the end of verse 2, "And the Lord heard it," which is a great warning for all of us. Do you know that God hears everything we say? How we talk to other people, talk to our spouse, the things that we say in our head. He knows our thoughts. So we need to be aware of our attitude, because God hears everything. And then there's this little parenthetical statement. It's kind of comical in verse 3. It says, "The man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth." And it's only comical because we know Moses wrote it. But most likely, Jesus called himself humble too. He said, I'm gentle and humble of heart. So if it's true, it's not bragging. And he wrote that in there, but it's kind of like this little parentheses. But it gives you some context for his reaction. And so God does this. He calls the three of them into a meeting. He's like, all three of you, it's kind of like you're getting called into the principal's office. Like Miriam, Aaron, Moses, you all come here to the tabernacle. And he rebukes Miriam and Aaron for speaking against his servant Moses. Verse 9 says, "The anger of the Lord was aroused against them, and he departed. When the cloud departed from the tabernacle, suddenly Miriam became leprous, as white as snow. Then Aaron turned toward Miriam, and there she was, a leper. So Aaron said to Moses, 'O my Lord, please do not lay this sin on us, in which we have done foolishly and in which we have sinned. Please do not let her be as one dead, whose flesh is half consumed when he comes out of his mother's womb.'" I think it's interesting that in this crisis, Aaron goes to Moses, but Moses goes to God in verse 13. And he just cries out to him and says, "Please heal her, O God, I pray." Now, these are family members. These are close people. Him and Aaron were like the dynamic duo of that time. God put them together to minister. Miriam had been there his whole life. These were close people, and they're coming against him, against his wife. And so this is like a very personal situation, if you can imagine being in that situation. And Moses could have gotten completely defensive. He could have just said, "You know what? It goes to show you that's what happens when you talk to God's man." But he was humble, so he wouldn't have done that. But he could have done that. And you can imagine Miriam, this disease, this terrible disease that at that time was incurable and untreatable. She would have needed a miracle in order to be healed of that thing. And you can imagine that the fear and all the emotion and Aaron seeing his sister and all this stuff is happening all at once. And Moses' gut reaction is to pray for them. And I wonder, when I look at myself, what is my gut reaction when people turn against me? When I get hurt, when I get in a disagreement, do I have the same gut reaction as Moses and I just fall on my face and just pray for them? Or what do? Do we call up all our friends and say, you never believe what so-and-so said about me? Do you go on Facebook and we blast them, or whatever, block them, whatever you can do? Do you defend yourself? Do you just get, argumentative and say, well, that's not true and blah, blah, blah? Or do we shut them out of our lives? But Moses didn't do any of those reactions. He instead interceded for the Lord for her restoration. And I can encourage you, there's a power in intercession of praying for people that turn against you. When you have aught with a brother or sister, somebody in your life, a spouse, somebody, you've got something and you can feel it in your heart. You know when you start getting upset, bitter, whatever. The best thing you can do is intercede for them. Because you can't intercede from your heart for somebody and hold anger and bitterness at the same time. It's like two different functions. You can't do it. And so if you get in an argument or something, begin to pray. And pray the prayer for them that you actually, don't pray, God, get them, like smite them or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about praying, or when you got people that are against you, pray that God would bless them. Pray for them that God, whatever blessing you have, give to them. Bless them immensely. Give them everything that they need, whatever they need in this moment. And you'll find that the direction of your heart will begin to change. But God was willing to heal Miriam, and it wasn't just the disease that she needed healing from. Imagine if she stayed in a leper every single moment of every day when she sees her hands rotting off and all the pain and being cast outside the camp. It would have been at every moment reminder of her sin and what she had done. She would have never forgotten that God had judged her based on how she came against Moses. It would have been an everyday shame, just continually. But God wanted to forgive that. He wanted to heal that, but he needed an intercessor, and Moses stepped in. The one who was attacked stepped in and said, I'll intercede for you, and God healed her. And so I want to encourage us all to develop a heart of prayer so much that even when we're wronged, we can pray for people. I mean, if you can't do that for someone in your life, there's an issue there. You need to ask God to help you forgive and to begin to pray for them. The third incident I want to talk about is the 12 spies incident, Numbers 14. This is a popular one. You'll know this story. They're right on the edge of Canaan. They're getting ready to go into the promised land, and they send in 12 spies, one from each tribe, and they're going to scout out the land, bring back a report of, so they can make a plan to go in. And the people, the 10 of the spies come back, and they're like, there's no way. Like, it's a great land. It's everything God said it was, but we're going to get defeated if we go in there. And they spread fear in the camp. And two men, Joshua and Caleb, are the only ones who are like, no, we can do this. But the people go with the bad report, and they decide, you know what, we're going to refuse to enter. And not only that, but in verse 1, it says, the congregation lifted up their voices and cried. The people wept that night, and all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron and the whole congregation and said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? Verse 4 says, they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. Now, think about the frustration of what Moses would go through as the leader of the nation, trying to bring them in. They're like on the cusp of entering into God's promise after all the battles they've been through. And now the people are like, not only are they refusing to enter, but they're like, let's forget about Moses, let's pick somebody else and let's go back into our slavery. And it's incredible, like you can imagine that moment, and God had done so much to get them out of Egypt. Moses had done so much. He had given his life over to these people, and now they're like, you know what, it was better back there, let's just go back there. And they're getting ready to cast Moses out and pick somebody else. Verse 5 shows Moses' reaction. It says, Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. I love how Aaron begins to join into the intercession. I think Moses rubs off on him. You see toward the end of these stories, we'll see it in another one, that it's not just Moses bowing down now in intercession, but Aaron is joining him as well. So Joshua and Caleb, they tear their clothes in grief, and they give this great speech. They're like, we can win the land. Come on, let's have faith in God. Don't fear. And the people come up with this great idea. Why don't we stone Joshua and Caleb because we don't like what they're saying? And God's glory appears at the tabernacle, and he talks to Moses. He says in verse 11, how long will these people reject me? How long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. It's similar to the golden calf story. God's coming back and saying, you know that plan we had back in Exodus 32? The offer's still on the table if you want to do this. And not only that, I'll make a nation even better out of you than I do out of them. And you say, well, what does Moses do? Well, Moses does the same thing. He goes to the Lord, I'll paraphrase, but he basically says, you know what, Lord, that's not really a good idea. Like, you rescued us out of Egypt, and the Egyptians, they're going to find out that you didn't, you didn't come through, and you were supposed to be the leader of this people, and everyone, you had a reputation. They're going to find out, and they're going to be like, he couldn't do it, and so that it's going to look bad on you. In verse 17, he continues. He says, now I pray, let the power of my Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying, the Lord is long-suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you've forgiven this people from Egypt until now. Here again, Moses prays in a way, he appeals to God's mercy. He says, God, because you're merciful, because this is your character, you said that you're abundant in mercy and that you're quick to forgive. You said those things about you, and so will you do what you do best for these people, even though they're rebellious and they're running against you? Moses he understood his relationship made it possible for him to tap in and move God's heart. And I want to tell you tonight, we have the same privilege that Moses had because we're children of God. God has saved us. He has brought us into his family, and we have the ability to go to him, and we can touch his heart. We can pray and ask God, can you change this situation? And he can actually change that situation. And we need to take our privilege. It's a high privilege for us. We need to take it seriously and tap into that place. And you might be here thinking, well, what can my little prayers do? You know, what can I do? Well, your little prayers and my little prayers can touch the heart of the God who can transform nations. We can touch the heart of a God that saves souls and delivers and has all authority. It's not about, prayer's never been about what we can do, but it's about us tapping into the God who can do all things. And that's a powerful place for us to be. And so I want to encourage you, don't pray small little prayers. Pray the small prayers, but pray for nations. Pray for presidents, pray for celebrities, pray for things that seem far off and you're not attached to, because God answers and responds to his people's prayers. That's how he set this up. And the devil will do anything he can to keep you from discovering that identity and authority that you have in prayer. He will ride you. When you set out to be an intercessor and you're like, I'm going to pray, the devil will come at you with every tactic. And one of his favorite ones is, nothing's changing, you might as well give up. Have anyone prayed for someone? I've been praying for some people for 16, 17, 18 years, and you haven't seen it budge. And the devil will come to you every time you go to pray and say, "Why? You've already prayed for this before. God's not moving. Look at that person." And you look at their life and you see, like, it seems like they're getting worse and further from God, and it's so easy to get discouraged, but we have to understand God will do something with intercession. He always moves, and we need to continue to press in. The fourth story I want to talk about is the Korah incident. We referenced this last time, but in number 16, I want to pull out some more that we didn't talk about last time. But this rebellion, there's 3 leaders. One of them's Korah. 250 community leaders are coming against Moses and Aaron. They're saying, what makes you so special? Why are you putting yourself above us? We can all hear from God. It's kind of the same argument as Miriam, the same complaint. And Moses falls on his face in verse 4, as he commonly does when someone comes against him. And he calls for a test. He says all the 250 leaders are supposed to, and Korah and Aaron are going to bring their censers where they built their incense, and they're supposed to meet at a place, and the Lord is going to choose which one is holy. And Moses challenges Korah, and he tells them, he says, why are you Levites? Why aren't you happy just serving at the tabernacle? God has called you, set you apart from the other tribes. Now you're trying to get the priesthood, so why do you have to have more? God's already entrusted you with a lot. And then Moses calls for the other ringleaders that are involved. They refuse to come, and instead they accuse Moses. Moses must have gotten so tired of being accused of stuff all the time. And again, here's what they say. Verse 13, is it a small thing you brought us up out of the land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness, that you should keep acting like a prince over us? Moreover, you've not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us inheritance of fields and vineyards. And he says, will you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. And Moses does get angry, and there's some emotion here, verse 15. And he tells the Lord, he says, don't respect their offering. I've not taken one donkey for them, nor have I hurt one of them. So Korah gathers all the congregation against Moses and Aaron at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and God's glory appears. And verse 20, he tells Moses and Aaron, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. And again, another point of decision. What's Moses going to do? We see both of them, Moses and Aaron. Verse 22, they fall on their faces and they cry out. They say, "O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin and you be angry with all the congregation?" And so God tells them, get everyone away from these three men and their families. We talked about it last time, that the ground opens up and literally swallows them and they perish that way. And fire comes down from the Lord and consumes the 250 others. And the next day, they're still complaining. They tell Moses, they say, you've killed the Lord's people. And this is what, and again, Moses in verse 44, the Lord speaks to Moses and says, get away from this congregation. I'm going to consume them in a moment. And again, they fall on their faces. It's like their default position is to intercede. Moses has developed such a heart that he can't do anything else. It's like the moment people come against him, he's automatically falling on his face in intercession. Verse 46, Moses tells Aaron, he says, take the censer and put fire in it from the altar, put incense in it, and go out into the congregation to make atonement for them, for wrath has gone out from the Lord, and the plague has begun. And Aaron took it as Moses commanded. He ran into the midst of the assembly. Already the plague had begun among the people. He put in the incense, made atonement for the people. Verse 48, I love this verse. It said that Aaron stood between the living and the dead, and the plague was stopped. This is a crazy situation, and there is literally a plague breaking out, and thousands of people are dying. I mean, this is serious. Like this puts COVID to shame. People are just dying on the spot all around. And Moses says, Aaron, go out there with the incense. And Aaron literally is taking his own life into risk and his health into risk. And he's going out, he's going to walk into the midst of the plague, in the midst of the people, to make atonement for them. He's willing to get messy. He's willing to go out into the mess. He didn't stand back and say, well, I'll pray from here. I'm all right. I don't really want to get involved with that. Or like, that's those people's problem. I wasn't the one complaining. Like, let them, I'll just pray over here, God. But no, Aaron literally walks into total chaos where people are dying. And it says he stood between the living and the dead, and he stopped the plague. I think it's a beautiful picture of Jesus, who stepped into our mess, the mess of our world, and died on a cross for us. But it also is a great picture of what intercession is, that you and I have the opportunity, when we intercede for lost people, we're literally standing between eternity for them. We might be the only one praying for them. We might be the only one who's interceding, and literally heaven or hell is on stake, and you and I have the opportunity to stand before the living God and say, here's somebody who's dead in their sin. They don't know you, but I'm praying that you'll make a way for them, and we begin to pray for them. We're literally taking our position, and we're standing in the gap for them when they don't even know how to pray for themselves. It's an incredible privilege of the believer. I think it's one of the most incredible privileges God gives us. And we step into their mess. Maybe physically, sometimes you'll intercede and God will give you strategies to go minister to people. Maybe He'll give you a word. He'll give you something. That God will give you things. But sometimes it's just stepping into the mess of spiritual warfare. When you begin to pray for lost people and pray for God to break through in people's lives, don't think the devil's going to sit back and crochet or whatever and just let you go. He's gonna be there, because he knows that he knows the power of prayer more than we do. I can guarantee that. 2 Corinthians, Paul tells us in chapter 5, he says that those who are reconciled through Christ, God has given us a ministry of reconciliation. You might be here tonight and say, well, I'm not called into ministry. You are called into ministry. Paul says every believer, you've been given a ministry. It's called a ministry of reconciliation, reconciling people to God. That's what we do. And whether you work in a secular job, or we call it secular, but whether you work at a factory, or you're a stay-at-home mom, or you're a teacher, or a parent, or whatever that role is, you have a ministry to carry out. It's a ministry of reconciliation. And intercession, I think, is one of the greatest tools that He's given us to see people reconciled to God. You and I stand between the living and the dead, and we can stand in the gap. And I'm so grateful, and I know you are too, that someone stood in the gap for you and me. Maybe a praying mom or dad, a grandparent. It might have been a neighbor that you never even met, and they were praying for your house before you got saved. It could have been a coworker. But all of us had somebody who became that person for us. And I want to ask the question, how will eternity be different because of your intercession for other people and for my intercession? We've got a responsibility to stand in the gap for the lost in our lives. One more brief story we talked about last time, the bronze serpent. Numbers 21. You remember that people are complaining against God. Strange story. God sends these fiery serpents out among the people, and people start dying from these snake bites. And Moses, the people actually come to Moses this time, and they ask him, they're like, we've sinned. Will you go pray to the Lord against us? We're all going to die here. And Moses does pray because they ask him to. In verse 8, God tells him to make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who's bitten when he looks at it shall live. And Moses does that. He sets up this bronze serpent, and the people begin to get healed as they see this serpent. What I want to bring out about this story that's really interesting is that Moses' intercession, when he goes to God to intercede, God gives him a divine strategy for the situation. That sometimes when you and I pray, if you want to hear from God, people say, I can't hear from God, I want to hear from him. Begin to intercede for people, and you will hear from God because you'll tap into his heart. And there are people in my life that God has given me even years ago. They're not saved yet, but God gave me a very specific way to pray for them. He showed me what their stronghold was. He showed me a unique way to pray. One of them was somebody that I've been praying for that God said, I want you to pray for people in their workplace to get saved, so that way they hear their testimony, and I want you to pray that they be surrounded by believers in their workplace. And that's how I've prayed. And every time I go to pray for that person, that same thought is always there. And God has given, He gives you divine strategies to target your prayers so that they can be most effective. Because when you and I intercede, we're not doing it alone. We're doing it in cooperation with the Holy Spirit. And as you pray, He'll begin to show you, hey, you might think this person's problem is this, but let me show you what's really going on. And I would encourage you to ask God, what's going on in the spiritual realm that I can't see here? What am I missing? What are the strongholds that are in this person's life, the deep root issues beyond the surface? What's going on? And God will show you. He'll be faithful to show you those things. And then you can run, and then you pray with even more faith and confidence because now you can tell God's speaking to you. And so I believe God's looking for men and women with the heart of an intercessor like Moses. Now we know God can do whatever he wants, but he chooses to work through the prayers of his people. 2 verses from the Old Testament through the prophets, Ezekiel 22:30. God is speaking. He says, so I sought for a man among them who would make a wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found no one. Isaiah 59:16, it says that God saw there was no man, and he wondered that there was no intercessor. It's kind of a heartbreaking picture that God was searching for somebody. If I just had one person who could stand in the gap for this land, if I just had somebody who would intercede, and he can't find anybody, it's like he's looking all throughout the land and no one's made themselves available to him. And I pray that it would not be that way for this church, for my own life, for our families, that God, if he's looking for an intercessor, that we'd say, God, sign me up. I want to do it. I don't ever want to let down my responsibility and the privilege that you've given me as your child. The reason the Israelite nation survived was because someone stood in the gap for them, and that was Moses, the intercessor. And I want to ask all of us, whose intercessor are you, and whose intercessor am I? If heaven being filled depended on our prayer life, who would get there, and who would we have left behind because we didn't pray? Maybe a marriage could be avoided, a marriage going into destruction, a family about to break up, and maybe God through our prayers will rescue the marriage and restore it. Maybe it's a relationship that's been broken and we can pray and see that mended. Maybe it's a soul being saved or a multitude of souls. Maybe it's a nation going into revival because of the prayers of God's people. I don't think these stories are given here so that we can sit back and say, you know what, Moses, you did a great job. You're such a great intercessor. We just honor you. I think it's an invitation, and God's saying, when you know me, when you tap into my presence, when you get close to me, I will do things that you can't do, but you can do in cooperation with me as you pray, and you can influence people's lives. You can influence, cities. You can influence nations. I know we see the enemy working all around us. It's obvious. But you and I, we don't have to sit back as bystanders and let the devil just do what he wants to do. You and I have a responsibility, and we have authority and influence that we can pray, and we can stop the enemy's work, right? He hates it when Christians intercede. I think it's one of his greatest fears, maybe his greatest fear. It's like he's got a situation, he's got his hands in there, things are going, and all of a sudden there's a Christian praying, and he's like, oh, like, game's up. I might as well give up. So now he's going to go attack that Christian, try to get him to stop praying. But as long as we're interceding, I'm telling you, God is moving in ways that we can't understand. And one day we'll see it, but we don't get to see all the fruits in this life. And so my encouragement to you is simple tonight, is simply take time, carve out time in your schedules. Maybe it's once a day. You say for 10 minutes, I'm going to pray for this person or this situation. Maybe it's an hour a week or something. But if we're not intentional, what happens is we just don't do it. If you don't set it apart and say, well, here's what I'm going to do. I mean, sometimes the Lord has led me on fast for a couple days or whatever and given me a person and said, for these couple days, I want you to pray for this specific person. And just be open to the Lord's leading to whatever that is and say, God, I want to be used. And I want to pray that tonight that God would use us as intercessors in this season of the world in 2022. So I want to pray as we close.